Welcome back. I wanted to do a video based on things that I've been dealing with lately about installing a two-stroke performance exhaust because there are probably many people out there who have never done it and may need some guidance. So I wanted to go over some of the pitfalls with installing a two-stroke performance exhaust. And right here is I've got my Yamaha QT50 because it was easily accessible and it's one of the lightest bikes and easy for me to throw up on the workbench real quick. And that is the MLM circuit pipe for the Yamaha QT50, which will demonstrate some of the pitfalls that you can run into when installing one of these exhausts. First of all, why install a two-stroke performance exhaust over a stock exhaust? Keeping the stock exhaust, for example. Well, the name suggests performance, so you're basically looking for greater performance. That's why you are installing a two-stroke performance exhaust, right? However, it's not all, cakes and pies, peaches and cream. There are some downsides to installing a two-stroke performance exhaust. And we'll get to those, hopefully, if I don't forget. I might forget. I'll get wrapped up in something else. But right now, let's go to the installation basics. Installation basic number one. Here we have a Yamaha QT50 cylinder, and the exhaust attaches to this part of the cylinder. And you see the two bolt holes right there. Now some people have studs coming out of their cylinder. You can remove the studs if you want, or you can keep them, or you could even add studs to this. I typically, on the Yamaha QT50, just use bolts to attach the exhaust to the cylinder. And the first thing you should do when attaching the exhaust is attach it at these 2 points and tighten up the bolts or the nuts, whatever you're using, securely. That's the first thing you should do. Now while I'm on this, the Yamaha QT50 exhaust kind of fits over this area here. On other exhausts, the flange of the exhaust will actually go in the exhaust opening here. And so I guess, well, we'll get to that. But consideration number one when installing a performance exhaust is to mount it to the cylinder first and not, don't worry about mounting it to the engine, the bolt hole on the engine. Do that later. So mount it to the cylinder first, and then consideration number two is if the exhaust flange fits into this opening, make sure it fits in, because some exhausts, the flange is the diameter's too great to fit into this opening. Like on a Honda, not on a Yamaha. As I just said, on the Yamaha, it fits over the opening, so it doesn't matter. But if you've got an exhaust where the flange goes inside this opening, you may have to open up this opening because the exhaust flange is too big. How do you do that? Well, here's how I do it. I take a Dremel tool with that bit, and then with a sanding bit later, and I take it and I open this up. This is just for demonstration purposes. I know a lot of you QT50 people might have not heard anything I said. Okay, on a QT50 you don't need to do this, but on other cylinders you do. Like for example, the Honda Urban Express or the Honda Express. If you're using a performance exhaust with a flange that is wider than this opening, because on those bikes the flange of the exhaust goes inside here. So those are considerations numbers 1 and 2. Consideration number 3 you might be able to see how this exhaust comes right up to the base of the foot pegs. Over the years, this foot peg assembly has been bent several times, so it sits funny. So one thing that I had to do was basically take the Dremel or a grinder and grind these foot pegs shorter so that the body of the exhaust is not constantly rubbing against these foot pegs. You know, basically, you don't want the foot peg assembly pushing down on the exhaust body because that'll cause you problems. You're putting strain on the metal of the exhaust, and if you hit potholes and such, basically you might cause the exhaust to break. Okay, consideration next. Here's where the exhaust mounts to the engine, this particular exhaust. Now, when you first mount the exhaust, you want to not mount that. You want to mount it to the cylinder at the two bolt holes that I pointed out earlier. And then see where the mounting hole lines up with this mounting hole on the engine. Sometimes they won't line up right. What you want to avoid doing is trying to make it fit. You know, some people will go over here and loosen up these bolts and then wiggle this around to where it'll work and then tighten that in all the way and then tighten in the cylinder bolts or the nuts depending on what you're using. And what that'll happen or what that'll cause is, see if I can find my demonstration tool. I found it, hold on. So if I do just what I described, if the bracket on the exhaust is not lining up perfectly with the mounting hole on the engine, and I go and I loosen those bolts over there at the cylinder so that I can finagle this to make it fit, and then I tighten this down, and then I tighten those down, well, what am I doing? Well, pretend this is the metal of the exhaust. What I've done is I'm bending it. I'm bending it. See how that's bent? To make it fit. And if I bend it, and then I go riding, it may not happen right away, but after you go over a bunch of bumps and potholes, wherever this is stressed because of the way you bent it to make it fix, it will break eventually. May not happen, you know, in a couple days or a couple weeks or a couple months, but you ride it enough, if you have flexed the metal, you're weakening the metal and putting tension and pressure at that point, it will eventually break if you hit enough bumps and potholes. So how to avoid that is you tighten it fully at the cylinder. You don't have a bolt here. You see if everything lines up. If it doesn't line up, you need to take a drill or a Dremel and widen this hole in the bracket so that it lines up with the mounting point at the engine. And so you should have a stress-free mount. You're not putting stress on the metal. That's like one of the biggest mistakes. I've made it. I know. I've made all these mistakes. That's why I can sit here and tell you about them. Okay, I've broken exhaust and had to get them re-welded. That sucks, especially when you spend a bunch of money on a new exhaust. So I'm not afraid to admit it. I've made the mistake. I'm telling you so you can avoid it. Okay? Don't sit there and watch this and think he doesn't know what he's talking about. He's an idiot. Because I've already been there. I was the idiot who did this. Okay? I've learned from my mistakes. It's not a mistake you can't overcome. I've overcome it. I've had the exhaust welded up. I bought a welder so I can weld it. It won't happen again because I won't make that mistake again. At least I hope not. after you've installed the exhaust is adjusting the jetting. Generally, you will have to put in a bigger main jet. Uh, if your only change has been the performance exhaust, maybe you shoot for a 5 to 10% bigger main jet. Now you may not need that, but you should start there and then work your way down until you find the perfect jet, because the exhaust system is going to pull more air through the system, through the engine, the combustion chamber. But if you don't change the jet, the fuel stays the same in that mixture, or the amount of fuel going into it. So you should try a richer main jet. Probably start with, to be safe, I guess, maybe 10% richer. So if you've got a 70 main jet, maybe you try 77. That might be too rich. Maybe you go to a 75. See where that goes. How do you tell if you're too rich? Generally, if the bike four-strokes excessively, of course we got to get into a discussion of four-stroking, that's where the bike, a two-stroke engine, is getting way too much fuel and it's kind of gurgling on the extra fuel. It's not able to burn all the fuel you're giving it. And what is excessive four-stroking? Well, some four-stroking is okay. I don't know, this might just be something you have to experience, but basically, here's a good test. I like to use a temperature gauge. If you don't have a temperature gauge, you probably should get one. If you don't get one, a good test is if you're going up a slight incline and your top speed is just about the same as it is on the flat, you're overjetted. Okay? So I've used that test plenty of times, and that's a good test. So if you're going up a slight incline and you're doing 33 miles an hour up the incline, and then if you go on the flat and you're only doing 34, 35, you're probably overjetted. Okay? Why is that happening? Because you've got too much fuel on the flat. However, when you've put a greater load on the engine, like going up a slight incline, the engine's able to use that extra fuel and propel you at a very similar speed to your top speed on the flat. That means you've got too big a main jet. Another way to test is with a temperature gauge. Generally, well, gosh, this is going to be very general, but I hate to put a number on it because, depending on your setup, it could vary greatly. But anyways, like for instance, this is a stock cylinder QT50, and it should run, I don't know, right around 360, 370 degrees Fahrenheit if you've got a temperature gauge at the cylinder head. If it's running way less than that, let's say it's running in the, mainly in the 320s, 330s, then my main jet is too rich, because extra fuel is going to cool the engine. Too much fuel is going to cool the engine too much. And if it's always running right around 320, 330, I know I need to get it closer to 360, 365, 370, so I need to change the jet. Now, that's just this particular bike. It's hard to generalize over a whole range of bikes because, different bikes, different engines, different setups, etc., etc. But, that'll give you some idea. Four-stroking, if it's four-stroking all the time except up a really steep hill, something's wrong. You probably got too rich a main jet. So it's going to take some figuring out on your part. That's just, you just got to get your hands dirty and try a bunch of different jets. And probably the best thing is to have a temperature gauge and watch the temperature gauge, ride it around for 10 or 15 minutes, let it fully warm up, and kind of determine what general range of temperatures it's running at, and then determine if that's too low, too high, or just right. Um, so there you go on jetting. Now some bikes, in my experience, some bikes were jetted way too rich from the factory. Generally, the Honda Express line, in my opinion, for the most part, was jetted way too rich from the factory. So, for example, the Honda Urban Express comes with an 85 main jet. When I put a performance exhaust on it, I started at 90. Then I think I went to the 85. Then I eventually settled on an 82 jet. So even with the performance exhaust, the jetting was way too rich from the factory, and I had to drop to an 82. Now, it's dangerous and not accurate to compare one Urban Express to another. Okay, these are what, 40-year-old bikes almost, and in various, people get them in various states of decay and various states of ill maintenance. So there are many factors on the bike which could affect how it runs. And I'm not going to go into all those now because I'll be here forever. But it's hard to compare one Urban Express to another. Some guy might say, well, I used an 88 main jet with my performance exhaust, but he could have, a scored cylinder and piston and rings that are so worn that thing is just letting all this fuel air mixture get past the rings. So he's got to have a really high jet in it just to compensate for that. Or maybe on his bike the crankshaft bearing seals are bad, and so he's got to have like a super high jet because he never fixed that, and those crankshaft bearing seals are letting in a bunch of air, especially at high RPMs. So he's got to have like a super rich jet on his bike. See, so you might want to take care of all the little problems like seals, gaskets, maybe get a new piston and rings. Might want to take care of all that if you're going to do the performance exhaust, because this exhaust is going to allow your engine to run at really high RPMs, higher than the stock. And when you go at really high RPMs, you tend to, for example, if your seals are bad, you may never notice it on a completely stock setup, but once you start doing 8, 9,000 and above RPMs, maybe 10, who knows what, they're going to suck in exponentially more air at those higher RPMs than they did at whatever, 6,500 RPMs. So if there are problems in your bike, high RPMs caused by this are going to reveal them much sooner than if you were just running a stock setup. All right, I'm over here at the clutch side because one of the downsides of a performance exhaust, probably because it's more free-flowing than a stock exhaust, is you lose bottom end. Bottom end, low end. Low end, acceleration from a stop or acceleration from low RPMs. So, how do you combat that? Well, on a QT50, one way is to go into the clutch here and put on stiffer clutch springs. What do stiffer clutch springs do? Well, they delay the engagement of the clutch to drive the drive shaft, to drive the rear wheel until higher RPMs. So instead of starting off at like, you get to 2,000 RPMs and that engages the drive shaft of the rear wheel, so you're only starting at 2,000 RPMs. It'll delay it to maybe 4,000 RPMs. So you get a greater oomph from the engine to help you start off and regain some of that low end if you start off at like double the RPMs that you normally would. On other bikes, like variated bikes with a belt, you can basically change the weight in the variator For example, the Urban Express comes with 78 grams in the variator. A popular thing to do is just remove every other weight so you go down to half that and 39 grams. In my personal experience, on a stock cylinder Urban Express with a performance exhaust, you need to probably go a little lower than that, but your mileage may vary. You know, I'd think maybe more around 33 grams is better. And then another thing you can do on a variated bike with a belt drive is go to a different belt. But the goal of a variated bike usually is to maintain your top speed and then get the best acceleration you can by monkeying with the weights to the point where you still, because you can go too light on the weights and then, you know, all of a sudden your top speed drops but your acceleration's great. It, you know, of course, maybe you want that. Maybe you can, okay, my top speed was 39, now it's 37, but my acceleration kicks butt, so I'm going to stay with that. So you can adjust the weights, you can change the belt. Generally, if you go to a shorter, thinner belt, your acceleration is going to be greater, but you're going to lose top speed. So you can play with it that way. So I'm sure in thinking about it, I probably will later determine that I forgot some things, but these are the considerations you need to take into account if you're installing a performance exhaust on your two-stroke bike. Hopefully they help. Thanks for watching.